All right, welcome to Your Time, Your Money. Today's episode, we are going to be releasing with a little bit of disclaimer that this is not meant for younger listeners. We will be talking about some child trafficking, and we'll be talking about some nonprofits that work in that space. So just so you know, this is not an episode specifically for children. Thank you for tuning in. This week on Your Time, Your Money.
And when you study conflict around the world in modern times, oftentimes it's abject poverty mixed with political institutions and warring coalitions going against each other. It just creates this cycle. And so you have to be able to break that cycle in some way. Otherwise, those kids will become engaged in the same conflict, and it just continues over and over again.
All right, welcome to Your Time, Your Money, the show where your time is just as valuable as your money, and we know that. I'm super excited today because we have a guest host on today who's actually a personal friend of mine, so I'm even more excited.
Guest host and personal friend. I love it.
In addition to Matt Turillo, yes.
It's not me. I'm not the guest host or the personal friend.
No, Nathan Mandsager. Nate Mandsager from representing ChildVoice today. Welcome, Nate.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Did you get an understanding of how big my co-host is?
Yeah.
Now he knows.
A little bit, yeah.
So just so our listeners know, so Nate's been in the wrestling world for a long period of time, and Matt as well has been in the wrestling world for. So maybe today we can get a match going down.
Match of the century
on the show, which would be great. So, I think it's always good to reflect for our listeners to reflect and viewers to reflect on. Purpose in life, and I think one of the purposes that a lot of people have is to be part of an organization or to contribute to an organization that's bigger than themselves. Yeah. And it's very easy in the Latham or Albany area or whatever area you're listening from to get caught up in just your community and what's going on.
Yeah, right? It's easy to stay local, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to stay local and say, this matters the most, right? Because it's clear and present.
Yeah,
right?
and and we start thinking about that more in times of turmoil, right? So right now, obviously the nation is going through 2 hurricanes and things happening in the Carolinas and Florida, which is
and then you see how slow we are to respond to help as a nation. Like, I think there was more donations locally in the last 2 weeks that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Trucks driving down and people filling water, water trucks.
And I think even in that mix, though, a lot of times we have a tendency not to focus on world issues as well. And we asked Nate to come in today to really put a focus on some world issues that, myself, living in first world, we have problems. But they're nowhere near what some of the issues we're going to discuss today. And hopefully our listeners can get a better understanding of a very valuable organization called ChildVoice and what they do and their purpose. Because, Matt, I know you don't know a lot about what they do, so you'll be hearing it for the first time.
It's great. I love it.
But it's very disturbing when you start realizing what goes on in the real world. And we're sheltered a lot and protected a lot by being an American and in our culture, which is great that we are blessed that much. But without further ado, I want to get into that a little bit. So Nate, I have a bio for him. I printed offline, and then I'll interject some other personal stuff that I know, which might be actually a little bit more.
Dude, that's where it gets scary. Is Mark? You don't know what Mark's going to say. He's kind of a wild card.
I haven't looked over his notes.
But I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about your relationship with ChildVoice and how that came about, because I think that is very unique in the nonprofit space. Sure. With the family ties, but Nate is CEO of ChildVoice, and you've been involved with ChildVoice for over 25 years now. You want to talk maybe a little bit about how that transition came in and what brought you to the CEO role?
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me today, guys. And it's always exciting and a little humbling to be able to share about what we do and the work that ChildVoice is about in this world. So just as a quick kind of overview, ChildVoice, our mission is to restore the voices of children silenced by war. And our focus is kids that have been impacted, displaced, and sometimes victims of war and conflict in the world. And the reality is, I'll get into some of the stats, but it's a lot bigger than sometimes we even can see in social media and news cycles and things like that. Because for us here in America, it's oftentimes a bit removed, and also the numbers are so staggering that it's easier to kind of just turn that off sometimes. And so I'll share a little bit more about that. But ChildVoice has been around now we're in our 19th year as an organization. My dad actually founded the organization back in 2005, but I was involved from that time, the very beginning. He and I went over to northern Uganda to explore what was happening in that region of the world at that time. The UN back in 2005, 2006 was calling at that point, over 20 years of rebel war that had been happening in that region, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And we didn't really know anybody. It's a kind of a long, crazy story of how my dad even got connected there, and then he and I went over. But it was in the midst of active conflict. The rebel army for years had been abducting children to serve as child soldiers and sex slaves and different things like that. And
terrible.
It was some of the worst atrocities that we've seen in modern times. That all said, we didn't know what we were going to experience, what we could even do. We really didn't have a plan. My dad had a bit of a framework in mind just based on his background in nonprofit work here in the U.S. and around the world. But when we got there, we saw that there was a significant gap. At that point, the Lord's Resistance Army, the rebel army, had abducted upwards of 50,000 kids over those 20 years. And so kids were escaping from captivity or being freed by the government army. They were coming back to an environment where the northern culture of Uganda had been decimated by this protracted conflict. And we saw that there was a gap specifically at that point for young girls that were returning from captivity. Most of them had become mothers of they had been married off to rebel commanders and had born babies out of those relationships. So when they came back, they were already traumatized by all of the atrocities they had seen and been a part of. Now they were coming back to communities that rejected them. And so we saw there was a gap specifically for girls ages 13 to 19 with children already and needing the long-term trauma counseling, the long-term support and care, not the short-term relief efforts that were necessary but weren't enough. And so
such as like food, housing.
Yeah.
Right, you're
housing.
talking basic amenities versus you need psychological rehabilitation.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And social rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Right.
And then along with that, the vocational training, because almost all of those girls would never go back to school if they ever had any schooling. So giving them the skills they needed to be able to eventually, the ultimate goal was to reintegrate them back into their communities, to become the mothers, the leaders in their communities, that they could take care of their children and really build a future for themselves. So that's where we started back then.
It's a heck of a lift.
Yeah.
Hopefully our audience can understand what you just said is not only it's social, it's emotional, it's religious, it's cultural, it's physical, it's actual, it's spiritual. You literally hit on every single element of a person's life.
Yeah.
And how these people, I'm guessing, were decimated. Mm-hmm. And then when they get returned back to normal life, it's in shambles.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you throw in the context that you're in an area of the world where resources are
very limited.
Or limited, if any.
Abject poverty is the norm across
clean,
that region.
Clean water.
Yeah, even before
power and clean water.
Yeah,
right.
even before the conflict happened. So, yeah. So you when you study conflict around the world in modern times, oftentimes it's abject poverty mixed with political institutions and warring coalitions going against each other. It just creates this cycle. And so you have to be able to break that cycle in some way. Gotcha. Otherwise, those kids will become engaged in the same conflict, and it just continues over and over again.
So ChildVoice's role is more of the long-term transition for individuals.
We often describe ourselves, and especially our leaders in the field today, would describe ourselves as a development organization working in relief contexts.
Okay.
which makes us unique, and oftentimes it's harder for the general relief organizations to really understand what we're trying to do. We're not handing out free stuff.
Right.
We're walking alongside young kids for a long period of time, 3, 5, 10 years, so that they can see long-term success and they can earn the livelihood for themselves with the skills they learn, the support, the counseling, the relationships.
More of a
The
continuous
teaching, the
continuous
mentorship.
relationship.
Yeah.
Right, and then
Yeah.
do you come alongside other organizations that provide the material resources that they need?
Yeah, especially when we're in context where there is still active conflict. So in Uganda, the war has been over now for 12, 15 years. The north is relatively peaceful, but now we're serving more and more refugees from South Sudan and Congo. And then obviously after 20 plus years of civil or rebel war in that region, the generational impact is still
Right, now the cycle's got to extinguish it,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, we're still
Are
dealing
you
with that.
finding that success in that area has kind of created a magnet, so to speak, for all the other areas around that are seeing that, like, hey, there are resources and programs here, and obviously people want to flee,
Yeah.
Other areas that are where Uganda was, 20 years ago.
Sure.
Are you finding that massive inflow is very taxing on your resources at this point?
Yeah, I mean, we are a relatively small organization. I mean, we're not competing with, the UNHCR's World Visions of the world. We have a niche in terms of who we serve, population we serve, and a way that we do that service. So it does make us unique, and we are 100% donor driven. So we're not receiving any government funds in any way. So it does... it allows us to stay nimble, but also, we're...
Do you have boots on the ground overseas consistently?
Yeah, so one of our key pillars of our organization is that though in the early days we did have some Westerners go over to help build and design the programs, all of our programs in Uganda and Nigeria are run by nationals that are from that region, that
They know the population, the culture,
exactly.
right,
Languages,
the people,
all of that, yeah.
Well, I imagine you
be
get a lot
tough
of
to-
people that come up that have benefited from
Right.
that
Yeah.
want to give back.
Yeah, in Uganda, for instance, we have about 45 full-time staff there, and I think we now have 10 or 12 that are former beneficiaries that came through our programs and are now
that are
working
giving
with
back.
us. Yeah.
And this is full-time jobs for them.
Yeah,
This is how
exactly.
they make their living and then also service the community around them.
Exactly.
Okay, so
exactly.
it's
So in
starting to see a platform where you can build now. Yeah.
In terms of areas of need, where is the biggest need that Child Voice has currently that our listeners can take away? Is it from a staffing standpoint? Is it from a I noticed on the website that there were different programs with like building a hut and refurbishing things. Is that the bigger need, or like what would you say is the primary need at this point for the organization?
Yeah, so the cost to do business has continued to escalate and increase.
Absolutely. I'm about to say,
like
how
anywhere
bad,
else.
How
in the
bad has your
world.
inflation been, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Nigeria's both Uganda and Nigeria inflations have been killers for us, especially over the last few years. So
Okay.
trying to keep up with that so that we're increasing wages for our staff so that they're able to provide for their families and really, create an economic engine in terms of our workforce and that sort of thing. So in terms of our needs, it's the daily running of programs. We have a lot of good infrastructure, although there's things like new vehicles that we have to kind of circulate and things like that. We have new program opportunities that we want to pursue, so that means adding more staff and locations and those sorts of things. We've just launched some partnerships in Ukraine now, and again, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's 50 million kids around the world today that are displaced by war and conflict, and we're serving 1,000 a year kind of thing. So
You're making a difference, but
we're making a dent, but
you want to make a bigger dent.
yeah, exactly.
Well, I know like recently you moved into the CEO role.
Yeah.
And that brought about a little bit of a family change,
Yeah.
being a little bit further away from your kids. But where are you envisioning maybe over the next 5 years taking Child Voice? Like at what level do you see yourself still focusing specifically Uganda? Do you see that building and outreach?
Yeah, so our flagship center-based program is in Uganda. That's what we started almost 19 years ago, and that's serving the most critically traumatized and vulnerable girls and their children still to this day. So that program continues, and it's had a lot of great success. Over 87% of our graduates are self-sufficient, earning livelihoods, paying their kids' school fees, that sort of thing. So we love that model. We're looking at replicating that model in Moldova, which is right next to Ukraine, and it is the poorest country in Europe, and human trafficking per capita is the highest in Europe, and things like that. So there's opportunities that we see ahead to replicate that model. But in 2017, we took our best practices and expanded into community-based work in the refugee settlement. And now we're able to serve hundreds of more kids at one time, because it's not the high cost, small numbers that the center-based program is. And then we replicated that model in Northeast Nigeria in 2018. And now we're working with partners in Ukraine to replicate that. But in all, we're now serving 7, depending on the time of year or the space, 8 different people groups that are impacted by war. And there's over 50 regions around the world right now that have active conflict and people are displaced. So we feel like there's more opportunity. I would love to see us in the next 3 to 5 years, at least in some shape or form, either through partnerships or directly running programs that we're in at least 3 to 5 more conflict zones. So we're serving 10,000, 20,000 more kids a year.
Now, does that create the need for domestic volunteers or domestic staff that you would need to look for at that point?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very small team here in the U.S., and it's primarily built around kind of administrative responsibilities and fundraising to make this all happen. So we have 3 full-time staff in the U.S. and then a couple part-timers and some contractors. One thing we've never had in our history is a full-time professional fundraiser. And so we've kind of pieced it together, and we have great partners that have been with us a long time, but we know we have to expand drastically our donor base so that we can pursue these opportunities and try to serve more kids.
I mean, I think you're hitting on a lot of things, and I feel like as our listeners hear some of these things, they're going to be foreign, right? I mean, human trafficking is something we've never ever talked about, right? War-related areas are something there's geopolitical pressure that affect the market, because this is primarily we talk about finance, but every once in a while we get into the weeds, and it's important people understand that every little bit helps.
Yeah.
And someone here making $20,000 or $30,000 thinks they're living on the brink. Well, now you look at a person that's in Ukraine or Uganda, and they're making $20,000 or $30,000, and they're rich.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They can survive on
not
that
even.
for years.
Not even.
Right. Or $10,000. Right.
Not even.
So
Yeah.
that just goes to show the relation. But I think it's important that you demonstrate how great of a system you've set up. You've almost set up like a school system in a sense, where the culture is going to be that you're safe and you're educated, and you're going to have the ability to grow, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
So it's super duper important that our listeners understand that, because there's going to be a lot of foreignness to this when they listen. So it's good that they see it through a scope of what they understand.
Yeah, and I did put myself on the line a little bit for trying to raise $1 million through this podcast.
Listen, it's okay.
I need a little help from the listeners, otherwise I'm going to be working until I'm 99.
We can do a bottle drive. How many bottles is that? We only need 50 million bottles, right? We're
That's
okay.
it. Yeah.
We'll get there.
Is that it?
One bottle at a time.
I think we're starting right there.
There you go.
There's one right there.
Yeah.
We got one. 49,999,999 left to go.
So what are maybe some areas that our listeners can log into, ways that they can contact you, areas of research that they can do on their own, so that if they want to give and they can open up their wallets and our hearts, what's the best way for listeners to do that?
Well, the best way to connect with us is through our website, childvoice.org. So you can message us through there. Obviously, you can give directly through there. I'm excited about the future in terms of not only being able to find more donors, but to really build more partnerships.
Yeah, but say partnerships is more important
Yeah.
because to have a donor do a one-time $500 donation is not nearly as important as having a partner that's going to say, hey, I'm going to give you $1,000 a year for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like hospice. They cycle through 90% of their donors every year.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So, like, they get a lot of donations, but
Right.
because it's usually at the death of a family member, it usually doesn't continue after.
Correct.
Yeah, and so retention of our current base and expanding that base, and to go back to something you guys were talking about before in terms of local, what's right in front of you. I think what we understand as an international organization, that for the vast majority of our donors and people that are going to connect with us and partner with us, we probably are lower on their priority list in terms of giving.
Right.
And that makes sense. I think one thing
because you're looking for systemic change, not immediate change.
Correct.
Right? And systemic change takes time, it takes effort, it takes thought process. It's not going to be, hey, here's your free kit.
Yeah.
We're out of here.
Right.
This is a lifelong thing you're talking
And to
about.
my point at the beginning,
Yeah.
international versus domestic
Yep.
is
Yeah.
Huge.
And I
Huge.
think the local support, the relief support for the hurricane, things like that. I think that's all stuff that we're responsible for.
That's immediate response, right?
Right. But I think it's a both and. That I would love for more and more people to understand there are ways in organizations like ours where you can have transformational impact at a global level while still doing the things locally. And I've always seen that those two fuel each other.
Right.
And they're not disparate and separated in any way. So anyway, I think, when I'm looking at partnerships with businesses across the country and internationally, we're looking for ways that companies can come alongside of us and have a relationship that's mutually beneficial, that there's things that we can give to them, whether it's, just informing their employees. We have one company that's looking to create an incentive program to send their staff to Uganda next year, or a couple of their staff to Uganda next year, which will allow them to be exposed and then have influence on the rest of the workforce when they come back. Obviously, there's initiatives and drives that we can do with companies that allow us to generate more and more exposure and awareness, but also obviously funds. We need resources to make the mission a reality.
And I would encourage listeners to partake in those types of trips. In the Christian world, in the Christian world, we call them missions, and it is life changing. It gets you out of your everyday, constant 9 to 5 work environment,
The grind.
families,
The grind.
safe environment. And it really puts into perspective how blessed we are as a nation and as an individual. So, for listeners that have never been to a third world country to volunteer and help out, I highly encourage it because it is really life changing, whether you're a Christian or not. I don't think an average person could walk into the world where there's a 9-year-old that's been raped from in a war-torn society and not have compassion for that person,
Right.
And it not move them to be in that environment.
And it changes you in the process, and then how you see your own life. And it doesn't mean you come home and you sell everything and you live in a box, but it does give you a perspective. And I'm speaking from my own personal experience. I wouldn't be where I am today had I not had those experiences, in the early 2000s when I got to travel overseas for the first time and come face to face with some of those
Those
terrors.
kids.
Yeah.
It's a terror.
Right. And then come back, and now when I'm paying bills or I'm making purchases, it's not that we don't still spend money on stuff, and probably some stuff I don't need, but it does give
Our
me
other
a
episodes
lens.
will help with that.
But it does
Make sure you
give me,
subscribe.
but it does give me a lens in which to see those things differently.
Yeah, makes you wonder a little bit more about how fast you spend, and your money could go a lot further if someone else had it, in this case. But
For sure.
So you're visiting the Capital Region today.
I am.
As we
Yes.
wrap
are you
up
local?
here.
Obviously, or
You're
from the area.
25 years here, and then we shipped out to New Hampshire. So
Yes.
Now
He's a lumberjack.
Now he's a lumberjack. Look at his beard and his small head.
Yeah. So my wife and I moved out to New Hampshire last year. That's where our ChildVoice head office is in New Hampshire, and it made sense for the season we're in. So we're empty nesters now, and Yeah.
So best places, listeners can go to the website. They can get information there. They can find donation links there as well.
Absolutely.
Any other things that you want to throw out as far as so our listeners know, best way to contact or things, areas of need?
Follow us on social medias. Just search Child Voice. That's another great way. We're every day, every week we're pushing out
Social
stuff.
media.
And not just follow, but share.
Yes,
Share to
please.
your community.
Like, share, subscribe.
We've got Giving Tuesday coming up, the first Tuesday in December, and that's all social media driven. It's just a great way for people, even if you're not ready to give to us yet, to share that out to your networks. It helps.
You never know
a ton.
when someone is.
Absolutely.
You never know.
And there's lots of great information on there, on the website. Annual reports, things that transform and renewed hope. There's a lot of resources on there. So if you're you want to see where your dollars are going. The website is very clear and very open. Actually, probably one of the most open I've seen as far as annual reports and everything.
Where money goes and what happens,
nonprofits.
right?
So you really get a clear X-ray of where that money's going. So with that being said, I know we're going into the end of the year, and Nate and I are going to talk after this a little bit about a partnership with us here for the year. But what Nate doesn't know is that we have a little gift for him while he's here. And
I had a feeling the surprise was coming.
From the partnership here. Now you have to take this back to New Hampshire with you.
You have to take the whole thing.
But we're going to kickstart your December
sweet.
with a $1,000 donation.
Thank you,
to
guys.
Child Voice,
Awesome.
from our group.
Awesome.
And yes, good luck into the bank with us.
I know.
It's the big check.
You need the 1 foot.
Thankfully, we have a couple of those at the office, and our bank will work with us to make it happen.
The big pen is nice when you sign it with the
absolutely.
big pen.
That's a normal size pen for me, though.
So we want to thank our listeners from tuning in today. If you'd like to find out more about Iron Tree Financial, you can reach us at 43 British American Boulevard in Latham, New York, 12110. You can reach us on the telephone, the old-fashioned telephone, at 844-444-YTYM for Your Time, Your Money. You can find all our episodes at yourtimeyourmoney.net for your net worth. And as always, it's your time.
And your money.
All right, guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Your Time, Your Money. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed today's episode, please feel free to share this with friends, family, coworkers, anyone else that you think might be interested. If you do have questions or topics, you can always email them to irontreefinancial@ceterais.com. Please follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Spotify, Google Play, and many other sources that were available. And you can reach us at 844-444-YTYM. And as always, it's your time and your money.